two guys that can do it all.
Too much electricity this morning.
This is a good time. We're having a lot of fun.
I had to do a triple take.
Ka-ching!
Why? Because of parity.
I didn't mean to offend.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
Load management is a dirty word.
Let him rip.
You know what? Circumstances provide the results. What? How do you do this once? Oh, Donnie, you've got such a good show there.
A network that is booming.
The Early Line, only on SportsGrid.
All right, T-minus 5 days and counting till the big game on Sunday, and we have got you covered all week long live from New Orleans on Radio Row. It is the Early Line, and we're going to be touching base all morning long with our cohorts there in New Orleans as we get ready for what is going to be, I think, a epic Sunday game, one final game in the NFL to crown a champion. I'm Joe Ranieri. I'll be joined by Ben Stevens here in just a couple of minutes as we're both excited for what should be the final showdown of what has been a very interesting 2024-25 NFL season. And it gets even more interesting when you consider some of the news and headlines that we got out of the NFL yesterday. What will this offseason provide us? Well, it might provide us with a whole bunch of new uniforms for some star players, including, well, how about the Browns' Myles Garrett now requesting a trade? That's right. The all-star pass rusher had gone out yesterday and said, you know what? Love Cleveland. It's great. It's been a really good time, but the fact is, I don't want to be spending another offseason here watching the big game. I would much rather be a part of it. And he had said, quote, as a kid, I'm dreaming of the NFL. All I focused on was the ultimate goal of winning a Super Bowl. And that goal fuels me today. Let me see if I can translate that. That basically means Myles Garrett is saying, I'm not getting any younger here, people. And the Cleveland Browns organization is getting more dysfunctional by the day. So there you got it. Not often the kinds of talent like a Myles Garrett becomes available. But quite honestly, after what we've had to deal with over the weekend in the NBA with star players, I guess why not the NFL? And a very, very familiar name to you all also, we learn, is on the trading block as the LA Rams have decided that the former All-Pro wideout of theirs, of course, the big Super Bowl MVP, well, LA is looking to trade him. That's right. Cooper Kupp is on the trading block, and news broke of this late yesterday. And, of course, Cooper Kupp shared that he doesn't agree with the Rams' decision to trade him, but he does look back on his time with the franchise with, quote, so much pride, end quote. Kupp also made it clear that he's highly motivated to resume his career elsewhere. And Cooper Kupp, 31 years old, 8 seasons with the Rams. He was drafted, I believe, in the 3rd round. He was the 69th pick in the 2017 draft. He did, of course, win that ring and win the MVP there. He was also the 2021 Offensive Player of the Year. Now, some injuries have hampered him a little bit along the way over the last couple of years, but make no mistake about it, Cooper Kupp is absolutely a player that can help a team that is looking to contend for a championship next year. And I know what you're all thinking, probably exactly the same thing I was thinking when this news broke yesterday. And that, of course, is, who are we kidding? The Kansas City Chiefs are going to figure out somehow to get Cooper Kupp in their uniform when it's all said and done. So the NBA may have garnered the trade headlines and the big superstars over the weekend switching uniforms, but it does look like the NFL not that far behind, with a whole bunch of very well-known all-stars could be wearing different uniforms next year. We'll take a look at the hardwood last night, as well as one of the biggest games, in fact, of the night was in Madison Square Garden, which is where Ben Stevens was to watch the New York Knicks come from behind and take down the Houston Rockets there, as Jalen Brunson, who knew Ben Stevens, was actually in attendance there and decided that, you know what, let me drop 42 points and 10 assists here, while also breaking a tie with Carmelo Anthony for third on the franchise list with his 18th 40-point game, as the Knicks came from behind to beat the Rockets 124-118. I mean, my goodness, what a great fourth quarter it was for Brunson, in fact, as he dropped 17 points to get the Knicks back in the game. They had trailed by 11 heading into the fourth quarter, and that was, of course, until Jalen Brunson kicked it into another gear. Good win by the New York Knicks there over the surging Rockets. Good win, I guess, if you're considering the fact that the Milwaukee Bucks had absolutely nobody playing last night, but the Oklahoma City Thunder did. They had SGA available to him, and boy, oh boy, he dropped 34 as the Thunder rolled past those shorthanded Bucks, 125-96. Now, when we spoke yesterday on the early line, Ben and I broke this game down and told you, got to be careful on who's playing for the Milwaukee Bucks. At this time yesterday, that spread was about 11 and a half. By the time that game went off, once we learned that there would be no Giannis, there'd be no Middleton, there'd be no Lillard. In fact, probably nobody you've ever heard of played for the Milwaukee Bucks last night. And boy, it showed, didn't it? They not only won the game, OKC, but they ended up covering the 18 points as well. So good win for the Oklahoma City Thunder. The Milwaukee Bucks now find themselves in a whole lot of trouble here. So much for the showing that NBA Cup final, when Milwaukee won in a blowout fashion over the Oklahoma City Thunder, and they were hoping to maybe bounce back and show their dominance. There was no dominance last night, but you got to have the players in order to beat a team like the Oklahoma City Thunder. And well, when none of them play in the game, it makes it extremely difficult for you to be able to get anything done there. Also, last night on the hardwood, though, as we switch over to college basketball, and this was really, of the 15-game slate yesterday, this was the premier matchup as we head to the Big 12, with number 16 Kansas taking on number 8 Iowa State. And boy, oh boy, Kansas just absolutely shut down Iowa State. Total desperation game for both of these teams last night, as both were riding losing streaks heading into it. And Kansas, of course, off of that epic meltdown and 21-point lead that they blew over the weekend against the Baylor Bears, the worst in Kansas basketball history. Would they bounce back? That was the big question. We talked about it yesterday and said, when you get two teams as good as Kansas and Iowa State who are struggling, well, they turn to defense usually. And that's exactly what they did last night, because defense is all about effort. And we saw a big effort with both teams. But once again, Iowa State just not getting the shots to fall. And that was the problem, as Kansas gets back on track, does not lose a record third game at Fog Allen this year. They handled business 69-52. Also, though, we learned in college basketball news that Florida State's Leonard Hamilton Yeah, well, he is stepping down. Florida State's all-time winningest coach says he's going to resign at the end of the season. 23rd season as the coach of the Florida State Seminoles, one of the all-time greats in college hoops. But like many of his peers prior, the writing seemed to have been on the wall for him. 456 and 290 in 23 seasons at FSU. So it's a new era in college basketball, and it's a new day for us here on the early line. We'll have much more when we get back here on the grid.
I have no idea how to categorize what Mavericks GM Nico Harrison pulled off, Joe. All I know is that he shipped off Luka Doncic without telling Luka about it.
If you thought conditioning was a problem for Luka, wait until you get a load of Anthony Davis tripping over air and then missing 40 games because he's like Glass Joe's.
The early line. Only on SportsGrid.
You know, they have a lot of hopes, and they thought last year they were turning the corner. Even early this year, they start turning the corner, and then you lose 13 games in a row.
Edmonton chipped away, got a late goal, won the game 4-3. I felt like they dominated the third period. They moved the puck on that power play. It was an exceptional hockey game. It went over the total.
Only on SportsGrid.
Your gut says Miami is going to win, and you should take the over. Your gut also said your NFT selfies would only go up in value. They didn't. But your head is on SportsGrid and knows the QB is in concussion protocol. The backup has a 45 QBR against the zone coverage. The New York team has the most sacks in the league. So yeah, trust your head. It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
And welcome back into the early line here on the Sports Grid Network. I'm Joe Ranieri, soon to be joined by Ben Stevens, no doubt, who happened to be at the Madison Square Garden last night watching the New York Knicks and Jalen Brunson come all the way behind from an 11-point deficit late in that fourth quarter to get the win over the Houston Rockets. I can't wait to hear from Ben and see what that crowd was like, because it looked pretty epic on TV last night. But we got plenty of other news and notes around the sports world, especially the NFL, where coming up shortly, we're going to hear for some of the folks on the grounds in New Orleans, especially from our good friend Kevin Walsh. We'll hear from him coming up here in just about 10 minutes. But yesterday, much like the weekend where it was all about the NBA headlines and star players trading uniforms and moving on from their teams, the only teams that they have known, well, apparently the NFL was sick and tired of hearing about it. So they also dominated the headlines late yesterday, and it started with the Cleveland Browns star pass rusher Myles Garrett requesting a trade from the franchise. I mean, if we're being honest, who didn't see this eventually coming? At 29 years old. It appears that Myles Garrett has pretty much had it with the Cleveland Browns organization. And let's be honest, who can blame him? The only thing worse for Myles Garrett would have been he'd be stuck in a New York Jet uniform for however long there. The chance of actually winning a world championship, well, it's fading as every year he plays for the Cleveland Browns. And it looks like he realized that. And he released a nice statement yesterday. Very nice. Let me see if I can paraphrase for you. Yada, yada, yada. Yeah, great. It's been wonderful, but I want to win a Super Bowl, and basically will not be doing that here in Cleveland. I don't blame him. And he is another very interesting availability here at 29 years old. He still has a lot left in the tank, and I think with the right team, my goodness, if you need a pass rusher, and which NFL team that is serious about contending for a championship doesn't, well, the availability of a Myles Garrett makes it extremely interesting. Now, the only problem is the general manager of the Cleveland Browns just last week, in fact, at I believe it was at one of the East-West games in college football as the scouting's coming. But the problem is the general manager said, I have no intentions of trading him at all. And he was talking about Myles Garrett. And if that's the case, we might very well, Ben Stevens, have ourselves a standstill here with the Cleveland Browns. But it's official. Myles Garrett has decided, I want to win. And the chance of me doing this in Cleveland, yeah, that's slim to none. So get me out of here.
Yeah, Joe, it's such a good point. My apologies for the technical issues we have had in our studio this morning. Maybe you still thought I was inside Madison Square Garden watching the Knicks and the Rockets late last night. What a game that was. A profitable one for me. We can discuss that a little bit later on. But one thing that really stood out to me in Myles Garrett's statement was a specific line. I know you paraphrased, allow me to quote, the goal was never to go from Cleveland to Canton. It has always been to compete for and win a Super Bowl. The reason I highlight that exact wording is because of the idea that, as you were alluding to last week in Mobile, in the build-up to the Senior Bowl, to look at the next talent about to arrive in the NFL, Browns GM Andrew Berry said those exact words as he did at the end of the year press conference in early January. Basically, the idea that we expect Myles Garrett to remain a Brown for the entirety of his career, and he'll have a direct path from Cleveland, Ohio, to Canton, Ohio, of course, the home of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So for Myles Garrett to exactly use those words, Joe Ranieri, was a direct rebuff, if you will, of his GM, that I am not interested in the individual accolades. I already have those. I am the reigning defensive player of the year. I have been first-team All-Pro 4 of the previous 5 NFL campaigns. I'm good. I don't want to go 3-14 anymore. I want to go 14-3 and compete for a Lombardi Trophy. And I think, Joe, Myles Garrett ushering this now is a direct sign of where things are headed for Cleveland. And that's disaster. They hold the second overall pick. They can rebuild. But from the Browns organization perspective, it actually would make a ton of sense to trade Myles Garrett, despite the fact he is one of the 3 best defensive players in the NFL year in, year out, because you can recruit some desperately needed draft assets in Cleveland, have a couple of first-round picks or early-round draft selections to try to fill out the roster elsewhere. Because of the Deshaun Watson deal, they gave up 3 first-round picks. They are still financially liable to this guy for over $100 million through the duration of his fully guaranteed contract. They are in a precarious position. I actually think dispatching of Myles Garrett would help the Browns and individually help Garrett as well.
Yeah, but the problem is the GM Berry, also known for trading for Deshaun Watson, Ben. Yeah. Basically, if you trade Garrett and move on from them, then I don't know how he maintains his job. But who can blame Garrett at this point? I mean, when he got with the team, Ben, I don't think, what were they, 0-17, 0-6? I mean, it's always been a rebuild, and then they spent all this money last year and one of the highest payrolls in the NFL. And what did they get? 3 wins. So I don't blame them for wanting to get out of Dodge.
Absolutely so, Joe. Myles Garrett was the first overall pick in the 2017 NFL Draft, of course, made by the Cleveland Browns. He has spent the entirety of his career in Cleveland. They won a single game before Garrett arrived. In his first year, they went 0-16, which allowed another number 1 overall selection for Cleveland. They draft Baker Mayfield. There is a very realistic possibility that both of their back-to-back number 1 overall picks are going to be gone from the franchise by the start of 2025. So much more to get to here on the early line on this Tuesday, including a check-in in New Orleans with Kevin Walsh. We'll do that up next, interviewing the best and brightest in the Big East.
Your gut says Miami is going to win, and you should take the over. Your gut also said your NFT selfies would only go up in value. They didn't. But your head is on SportsGrid and knows the QB is in concussion protocol. The backup has a 45 QBR against the zone coverage. The New York D has the most sacks in the league. So yeah, trust your head. It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
I have no idea how to categorize what Mavericks GM Nico Harrison pulled off, Joe. All I know is that he shipped off Luka Doncic without telling Luka about it.
If you thought conditioning was a problem for Luka, wait until you get a load of Anthony Davis tripping over air and then missing 40 games because he's like Glass Joe's.
The Early Line. Only on SportsGrid.
Welcome back to the Early Line on this Tuesday on SportsGrid. Super Bowl week is already underway in New Orleans. Yesterday on Radio Row, our Kevin Walsh sitting down with Yahoo's Jason Fitz to preview the biggest game of every single NFL season.
Out here on Radio Row in New Orleans, Kevin Walsh with Jason Fitz of Yahoo Sports and NFL analyst over there. We're out here getting ready for Eagles-Chiefs. We've seen the game before. 2 years ago in the Super Bowl. They played the year following, actually, at Arrowhead. Both teams were off of a bye. The Eagles win that game. I don't think calling it 1-1 is fair, though, because winning the Super Bowl matters a lot more. I'm curious, when you started to get into this game here, the Chiefs favored in the matchup, how much did you look back at the performances from the two teams in the first Super Bowl meeting that we saw 2 years ago?
Very little, honestly, because if you're looking at the Eagles, I mean, you're talking about a complete transformation, offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. Like, it's a different team. So what's difficult here is that as much as we want to look at, hey, Philly was up in that game at the half and they had every opportunity to win, I don't know how that plays into this situation, if we're being honest. And that's one of the hardest things. Like, all of us that love sports or cover sports spend so much time talking about the history of matchups. And the history really is so meaningless to what's actually going to happen in this game.
Sure.
The history that I look at that matters in this game is look at Andy Reid and his record off of bye weeks. Look at the success that Steve Spagnuolo, their defensive coordinator, has had in the NFL playoffs. Those are the things that I think those are palpable stats and information that you can take with you moving forward. But the matchup before, I think Philly is just a wildly different football team, and they didn't have Saquon then either.
Yeah, they absolutely are. I think on both sides of the ball, I could argue maybe more even defensively, because the defense going into the game 2 years ago was led by a great sack unit. Everyone knew the secondary was vulnerable. The line couldn't get there for the reasons that they couldn't get there. Mahomes lit them up. I'm fascinated to see, and I'm curious what you're expecting out of Pat specifically in the game, going up against what I think is pretty confidently the best defense in the National Football League.
Yeah, you're 1,000% right. And by the way, home run of an offseason to be able to get Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, two guys that I've been lucky enough to cover the draft at this point for the last 8 years, and they were both can't miss prospects that somehow were still sitting there. It's the way the board falls sometimes.
Yeah.
You're right. I think what's going to have to happen here, though, is Mahomes is going to have to get the ball out of his hands incredibly quickly, which he's been doing anyway. But especially when you apply the pressure up the middle that we expect that they will be able to apply. Joe Thuney moving out to tackle has helped solidify the offensive line for the Chiefs, but I would argue that makes them vulnerable right up the center, and we all know if you can get to a quarterback up the gut. So I'd expect that Andy Reid's going to be moving the pocket around a lot of it and trying to find ways to get Mahomes moving a little bit, and then he's going to have to get rid of the ball in lightning speed over and over in it.
And you pair that, the rush attack has really struggled, though I found their ability to run the football in the red area against Buffalo to be the complete difference in that game, where quarterback runs from Mahomes that they never call. Kareem Hunt had a big run early on. I do think that is one of the maybe fascinating swings of this game, is if Kansas City can run it with some effectiveness, stay balanced and on time, I wonder if that presents some challenges that Philly maybe isn't necessarily prepping for.
Yeah, and look, the Chiefs aren't a great run team, but they're an efficient run team.
Yeah.
When they need to be able to run the ball, they do. And that's an interesting element in this game, because the aggressiveness of the Eagles' defense is something that Kansas City is going to try and take advantage of. So even if it's not flat out normal, line up, like we have this concept of what the run game looks like based on what it looked like 20 years ago. Now there's so many creative ways to run. I would expect also a lot of jet sweep sort of stuff, like how can they try and keep movement and motion and try and just slow down the interior of that defensive line for Philly, at least for a second, to see if they can get some space.
We're here on Radio Row with Jason Fitz, Yahoo Sports inside coverage, right?
Yes, inside coverage, Yahoo Sports.
As we're getting to button up here, do you in this moment feel that you have your pick settled for this game, who you actually think wins it?
Yeah, because even though it's not logical, I always go back to this number. There have been 7 times in Patrick Mahomes' career in the playoffs or Super Bowl that he's had the ball in his hands with under 4 minutes to go in the game, needing a score to tie or win. 7 times. For example, Brady had 11 times. 5 of those times he got the score. Drew Brees had 6 times in his career. 3 of those times he got the score. The league average is about 40. 7 times Mahomes has had the ball in that situation. All 7 times he got the score. And the problem is the only way you beat the Philadelphia Eagles is if you are up by more than 2 scores. Even though beat the Chiefs.
Yep.
Even though I believe the Eagles are a better team and it's a matchup nightmare, I can't get those numbers out of my head. I think Kansas City wins the game, and all of us are trying to figure out why, because that's just who they become.
It is. I think what's so interesting to me is, can that Eagles defense for 60 minutes present enough challenges where the offense can extend? Because I think the Buffalo defense was not at this level, and all of a sudden Pat looked as smooth as he did. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch play out, a lot of fun talking ball with you.
Always, my friend. I appreciate you.
Yep, make sure Yahoo Sports, Jason Fitz, covering the National Football League.
two guys that can do it all.
Too much electricity this morning.
This is a good time. We're having a lot of fun.
I had to do a triple take.
Ka-ching!
Why? Because of parity.
I didn't mean to offend.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
Load management is a dirty word.
Let him rip.
You know what? Circumstances provide the results. What? How do you do this one? Oh, Donnie, you got such a good show there.
A network that is booming.
The Early Line, only on SportsGrid.
The countdown to Super Bowl Sunday now stands at just 5. It is Tuesday of Super Bowl week as we continue to get you prepared for Super Bowl 59 between the Chiefs and the Eagles. Joe Ranieri, as we look at the updated odds, actually quite a bit of movement yesterday in terms of some of the prop markets, but we start, of course, with the actual numbers for Super Bowl 59, minus 120. Now, that updated money line price in favor of KC, again, we're talking a couple of cents on the money line, but yesterday morning it was minus 126. It is now minus 120. Our over-under stands at 48.5. This is the closest distinction between the two sides for Super Bowl 59 we've seen just yet. Getting closer and closer, it would seem, Joe, to a pick'em.
Yeah, it is. I mean, let's not forget, Ben, 2 years ago when these two teams met, don't forget it was the Chiefs that were the favorite early, and then the Eagles' money started to show up, and then, boom, all of a sudden it looked like the Eagles were going to go off as the favorite, and it looks like that could very well be what's happening here. They were flipped to a 2.5-point favorite late last 2 years ago, and it looks like we're getting a little bit closer to that pick'em price here as the Eagles' money continues to flow in.
There was actually a decent amount of movement for Super Bowl 57. To Joe's point, KC opened as an ever so slight favorite. A flurry of movement on the Eagles, sustained bets on the Eagles as well, and Philly closed as a 2-point favorite. Total was on the rise drastically for Super Bowl 57 2 years ago out in the desert as well. North of 50, 51, 51.5. It is our only over in our last 6 Super Bowls, the previous matchup between KC and Philly. We also saw some movement yesterday in terms of the quarterback props as we continue to find those edges in our Super Bowl 59 prop primer. Patrick Mahomes' passing yards number down by just 1, but now 250 and a hook. His rushing yards prop, as we shared yesterday, up by a full yard from where it was at open. Jalen Hurts' passing yards prop up by a yard, but maybe more substantially, Joe, that rushing yards prop for Hurts, 41, 40.5, now down to 36 and a hook. I don't know if yesterday on Super Bowl media night, Jalen Hurts walking up to his individual podium looked like he had a little bit of a limp, still dealing with that left knee injury and potential issue for Super Bowl 59. But that dropped by 4 yards yesterday, Joe, which I found a little bit intriguing for Philadelphia's quarterback, who was the Eagles' leading rusher in Super Bowl 57.
Yeah, and, it was funny. We talked to Dr. David Chow yesterday here on the show, Ben, and he didn't seem overly concerned about anything to do with Jalen Hurts and the knee and the injury, and he thought, an extra week worth of rest, and, he should be good to go because he did rush it pretty well in that last game against Washington, and we were a little bit concerned. So I'm kind of shocked that number is dropping the way it is.
He wasn't necessarily his mobile self, had 10 attempts for only 16 yards and yet did score 3 touchdowns. We'll see. That mobility, obviously a key factor for Jalen Hurts, as it is for Patrick Mahomes. What is very interesting, Joe, about Patrick Mahomes as we got ready for the AFC Championship, 7th consecutive year for Kansas City, with Mahomes as the starting QB, playing in said AFC title matchup. His numbers in AFC Championship games, prolific. In 5 of the 7, 275 yards at least. 16 touchdowns now to only 2 interceptions. In the Super Bowl, they're not nearly as large. He throws for some yardage, but the touchdown to INT ratio, 7 touchdowns to 5 picks. For Super Bowl 59, his anytime INT price is only minus 102. He fumbled the football against Buffalo a few Sundays ago now, but that was the first turnover KC had in 8 consecutive games. They have not been a turnover team since the early portion of this season, when Mahomes was throwing many balls into danger and had high interception rates. Not necessarily the case, Joe, entering this specific matchup against the Birds.
Yeah, and listen, I do think we have seen Mahomes do a couple of things when you get to that final game of the year, right? He uses his legs more, and he might be a little bit more inclined to take a few more risks throwing the ball than he has certainly down the stretch in the season. It wasn't good early for him, but don't forget, they were still trying to figure some things out offensively. I mean, they had all the injuries. Hollywood Brown was hurt. They had a lot of injuries early on the offensive side.
Yeah.
Once that settled down, so did the INTs for Mahomes. But with one game and winner take all, wouldn't shock me if maybe Mahomes puts the ball up for grabs a couple of more times here.
Did throw an interception, at least one, in the first 7 games KC played this year. In total, he had 9 INTs in those opening 7 games for Kansas City. Then the regular season loss to Buffalo, multiple interceptions, yet 3 touchdown passes. The only other game throughout this entire campaign, Mahomes has tossed an interception. He has been clean, but again, 7 touchdowns to 5 INTs. This will be the 5th Super Bowl appearance for Kansas City in the last 6 years. In the prior 4, Mahomes has thrown an interception, at least one, in 3 of 4. The only one he was clean against these Eagles in Super Bowl 57, now 2 seasons ago. Well, under his passing yards prop in that game, only $182, but efficient, 21 of 27 in 3 touchdown passes. Joe, Philadelphia as a team has won the turnover margin throughout their 3 playoff games 10-0, meaning the Birds have not turned the football over a single time, and they have forced 10. They have forced 10 turnovers, 4 from Green Bay, 4 from Washington. The Commanders did not turn the football over in their opening 2 playoff games, and still multiple turnovers forced against the LA Rams. It has been a calling card for success for this Eagles defense. One of the reasons they are the best this year around the NFL, and also playing clean football on the other side. Look at Jalen Hurts' anytime interception price. Often for every NFL game, quarterbacks are near even money, even into minus money. Those are the best of the best. That's a plus 130 price. Basically, the odds makers on FanDuel telling you it's rather unlikely that Jalen Hurts puts the ball up in harm's way against this Chiefs defense.
Yeah, and it makes sense because not as the arm of Jalen Hurts goes, but as the legs of Saquon Barkley go, is how this team is going to go. I think fewer opportunities throwing the ball here, Ben, correlate to less of a chance of a INT, right? Because, 18 and a half completions, 27 and a half attempts, that's not a lot. And we know that Kellen Moore has kind of dialed it back a little bit here. And I think that's why a lot of people are looking for the Jalen Hurts and his tight end combo in this game, where you have less of a chance of things going wrong there as a safety valve.
Of course, Jalen Hurts did not throw for more than 131 yards in the first 2 playoff games for Philadelphia, shaking off some rust. He, of course, exited early in Week 16 in concussion protocol. And then there was the issue with the left knee injury entering that NFC Championship game against the Commanders. His prop was only 180 and a hook at close. He skied over that, 20 of 28 for 246 yards and 2 touchdowns. But neither quarterback, Joe, in this Super Bowl 59 matchup, in this postseason run, has thrown the ball more than 28 times in a playoff game. Yeah. In today's NFL, for two teams that are now about to square off in a Super Bowl, neither quarterback has even flirted with 30 attempts throughout this postseason, and yet you see Mahomes at 36.5. His high, 26 against Buffalo, 25 in the opening playoff win in that divisional round victory against the Texans. Now let's focus on establishing the run. We do that next on TEL. I have no idea how to categorize what Mavericks GM Nico Harrison pulled off, Joe. All I know is that he shipped off Luka Doncic without telling Luka about it.
If you thought conditioning was a problem for Luka, wait until you get a load of Anthony Davis tripping over air and then missing 40 games because he's like Glass Joe.
The early line. Only on SportsGrid.
You know, they have a lot of hopes, and they thought last year they were turning the corner. Even early this year they start turning the corner, and then you lose 13 games in a row.
Edmonton chipped away, got a late goal, won the game 4-3. I felt like they dominated the third period. They moved the puck on that power play. It was an exceptional hockey game. It went over the total.
Only on SportsGrid.
Your gut says Miami is going to win, and you should take the over. Your gut also said your NFT selfies would only go up in value. They didn't. But your head is on SportsGrid and knows the QB is in concussion protocol. The backup has a 45 QBR against the zone coverage. The New York D has the most sacks in the league. So yeah, trust your head. It's smarter to be on SportsGrid.
It might sound cliche, but if defense wins championships, then making sure you play complementary football on the other offensive side of the football is key as well. That means running the dang ball. We'll see who does that with more effectiveness in Super Bowl 59. Because, Joe, there is no doubt that Saquon Barkley is the star, the best running back in the National Football League, having a historic and record-setting season. Which begs the question, how can Kansas City keep up, and what will the game plan be offensively for KC in terms of trying to establish that run? It has not been a dominant part of their attack this season, and kind of two changing guys anchoring that backfield now for KC. Kareem Hunt, the lead back. He has been KC's leading rusher in each of their first two playoff victories. 17 carries, by the way, for 64 yards and a score in the AFC Championship game against Buffalo. But in Super Bowl 57, it seemed like a very promising future for the rookie out of Rutgers. The seventh-round pick, Isaiah Pacheco, 15 carries, 76 yards, scoring a TD against Philadelphia. But you can see the numbers there. Whether it's Hunt, Joe, or Pacheco, how important is it for the Chiefs to establish some sort of a run game against this stellar Birds defense?
Yeah, well, they're going to have to do it either by, and unfortunately for Pacheco, he's not even close to 100%.
Right.
I think he's a shell of what he normally should be. In fact, he's really the second choice out of the backfield to Kareem Hunt. But I think they have to pick their spots because I do think the reason that Patrick Mahomes' attempts number is so high, Ben, is because I do think the very short, quick passing game is also going to be their running game in a lot of aspects here. But I think when they're in Philadelphia territory, I believe they are going to have to be able to run the ball. They're going to need Kareem Hunt and Pacheco and that combination to be effective inside the Philadelphia 40, where they got to move the chains, get a little bit closer, and open some things up for them there. It's not going to be the end-all, be-all like it may be with Philadelphia as far as the running game goes, but they are going to need to pick their spots, and they're going to need to be effective moving the chains inside of Philadelphia territory. If they do that, they might only have 50 yards, but that's all that really matters at that point.
Yes, I would agree, Joe. That's an important component of it. Are we asking Kareem Hunt and Isaiah Pacheco to combine for $150 and rival Saquon's numbers on the other side? No. Do you still need to have a running component against this Birds defense? Absolutely. I don't think Matt Nagy or Andy Reid or Patrick Mahomes at this moment would tell you, hey, our recipe for success of making history, winning a third consecutive Super Bowl championship, and hoisting yet another Lombardi trophy on Sunday night in NOLA is for Mahomes to throw it 41 times and sky over that pass attempts prop of 36 and a half. It would be quite the opposite. But, Joe, I think you could argue in a sort that's kind of what plagued the Commanders against the Eagles. Of course, Washington was basically trailing the entirety of the game after their opening offensive possession when Saquon Barkley broke off a 60-yard touchdown run on the ensuing offensive play for Philadelphia. But Jaden Daniels, as he often has done this year, was the Commanders' leading rusher. 6 carries, 48 yards, finding pay dirt as well. The two running backs, Brian Robinson Jr., who was actually great against Detroit in the divisional round, and Austin Eckler combined for 19 carries for only 51 yards, just 2.7 yards per pop. The Chiefs need to be more effective than that, it would seem.
Yes, they are absolutely going to need to be a little bit more effective there on both sides. They're going to... To me, the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes' ability to get there, move the chains, utilize, it can't have 3rd and 8 all the time, Ben, right? So that I think the 1st and 2nd downs are going to be huge for Mahomes and Kansas City. Get themselves into manageable 3rd downs. And quite honestly, when everyone's looking for a pass, utilize that running game in order to be able to move those chains. You just can't get back there 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9. That's what they have to avoid at all costs against this defense of Philadelphia.
You know what is going to be, I think, a fascinating prop, Joe, is when you look at just Kansas City's number as a team. I'm trying to hunt down KC's rushing attempts prop. I can't seem to find it right now because that would be key to me. But when you look at just Kansas City as a whole at this moment and what they would need on the ground, their total rushing yards number for the Chiefs to have 100 plus, minus 210, 125 plus, plus 115. That's not a large number as a team to have 125 rushing yards, but you saw what the odds are anticipating for both Kareem Hunt and Isaiah Pacheco. Pacheco exactly 5 attempts in each of the 2 playoff games so far. Again, Hunt had 17 carries for 64 yards and a touchdown against the Bills in the AFC title game. Mahomes carried it 11 times in total for 43 yards in 2 scores. The Chiefs, it wasn't necessarily prolific, but 35 attempts in that AFC championship game against the Bills. Of course, though, Joe, when you talk about running the football in Super Bowl 59, now just 5 days out, a big focus on Saquon Barkley. Now, I don't know if he is going to get over this number, but, Joe, would you advise to many people who say, hey, that's just such a large expectation for one individual in the biggest game of the year against the KC front, who has been dynamic all season long. Would you ever advise betting the under on Saquon Barkley's rushing yards number?
I would fade Barkley altogether because that's where the value is. I would go unders on everything Barkley here. And for a number of reasons, Ben. Number one, if you and I know it, you don't think the Kansas City Chiefs defense and Spagnuolo know it. They have no interest in allowing him to take over this game in any way, shape, or form. Those numbers are going to be virtually impossible if Kansas City dedicates all their resources to making sure he doesn't get it.
Joe Mixon had success on the ground against KC. James Cook, 13 carries for 85 yards in that AFC Championship game. You would expect Saquon to keep pace. It's a very high expectation. However, now to the pass catchers next.
We're going to get rid of all the badness, if you will, over the past few decades for the Raiders and set yourself up for the future. It's a horrible job to take if you expect to win, but it's not a bad paying gig, so go ahead and take it.
With an owner in Mark Davis who has continued to make bad decision after bad decision. Does Pete Carroll leave a culture behind that Joe Brady in 2 to 3 years takes over?
The early line. Only on SportsGrid.
But don't tell anybody. I'm sick of coming here every year and talking about the Kansas City Chiefs.
Look, remember a few years ago we were here, people saying, Andy Reid's going to retire. I'm like, no way. When you're riding Seabiscuit, Secretariat, when you're riding a horse that you know can win, who would jump off that?
Pharrell Coast to Coast. Only on SportsGrid.
It is your Super Bowl 59 prop primer, live right here on this Tuesday on the early line on SportsGrid. It is Super Bowl week. We are now 5 days away. The countdown rolls on from Super Bowl Sunday in the Big Easy for the biggest game of every single NFL season, the Chiefs and the Eagles. We've talked the quarterback comparison. We have looked at establishing the run. Saquon Barkley versus the two-headed, I wouldn't call them a monster, but the two guys for Kansas City in the backfield. Now let's talk those wide receivers and, of course, a look at the tight ends in just a few as well. Jalen Hurts' passing yards prop is only 211 and a hook. You mentioned the completions number. It's 18.5. Philadelphia not expected to be overly prolific through the air, but I'm not so sure that's going to be the case. So as we look at their two-star wideouts, you see them right there on your screen, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. How do you plan to break down the wide receiver numbers for the Birds entering Super Bowl Sunday?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, we know a couple of years ago, don't forget, it wasn't like Spags changed his philosophy from a couple of years ago to this year. In 2022, they blitzed the crap out of Jalen Hurts, if you remember. And Jalen Hurts, by far, played the best game of his career against the blitz when he was running, getting out of the pocket, and his go-to guy was, of course, Brown. He absolutely loved – those guys were on the same page. He was able to roll out. He was able to throw on the run. And who was he able to find? A.J. Brown all day long. So the question is, if I'm the Chiefs now, and I know that Brown is Hurts' go-to receiver against the blitz, and I'm still coming after him, which we know Spags do. Are we doubling A.J. Brown? I would think if you learn nothing in 2022, you should learn that his go-to guy is always going to be A.J. Brown with pressure on him. And if you're getting pressure, that means Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, some of the other guys are going to have that one-on-one opportunity. There's no way Spags leaves A.J. Brown one-on-one with anybody, including Trent McDuffie. I believe they take away Brown as best as possible, leaving Devontae Smith. And, well, Chiefs don't cover tight ends anyway. We know that. But I think Devontae Smith is the guy who's poised for the most opportunities.
And you see the disparity in the yardage number, but not necessarily in the receptions prop. Both at 4.5, and yet they differ by 21 yards in that other component. A.J. Brown seen as the big play threat. He had more than a 40-yard touchdown catch in Super Bowl 57 against KC. Jalen Hurts, the quarterback for the Birds that day, threw for 304 yards. So both Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown had a huge day. The first time they saw Kansas City in a Super Bowl. 9 targets, 7 grabs, 100 yards for Devontae Smith, Philly's leading receiver that day. But A.J. Brown, not bad. 8 targets, 6 grabs, 96 yards, and a touchdown, which was the exact same stat line that A.J. Brown had in the NFC Championship game against Washington this season. 8 targets, 6 grabs, 96 yards, a touchdown. A lot was made, and it was very well documented, Joe, that A.J. Brown in the opening 2 playoff wins for Philadelphia, just 3 total grabs in 24 total yards. Joe, I think there is an interesting argument to be made that a lot of the cast and crew is the same this year. Obviously, the upgrades for the Eagles, along maybe the defensive front, although they were pretty good entering Super Bowl 57, but certainly in the backfield with a guy like Saquon Barkley. I think the Chiefs' wide receiver room is far better in Super Bowl 59 than it was in Super Bowl 57, and yet, with that being said, still nobody here on this graphic even has the highest receiving yards prop for that of Kansas City. That is Travis Kelce, who we'll talk about in just a little bit. How do you approach the wideouts for Mahomes and KC come Sunday?
Yeah, so Xavier Worthy is the interesting one here. And because I do believe that Andy Reid, and much like Sirianni, they're not going to overthink this. You get the ball into your hands of the playmakers. And I don't think there is a bigger playmaker on that side than Xavier Worthy, and he has proven it to be and has really come into his own this year, which has got to frustrate Buffalo Bills fans. But the reality is Marquise Brown hadn't been there long enough. Schuster is old, reliable. And listen, nobody paying attention to D-Hop. Be very careful with D-Hop. The guy can still play.
That's 1 catch for DeAndre Hopkins, and he has 12 receiving yards in Super Bowl 59. Hour number 2, that's up next.